Anyway, starting a little late, but hello and welcome. Let me try that again. Okay, mic test, microphone test. All right, looks good. I should have done that before we started. Hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Luke, and today we are going to only really read one chapter today. I'm gonna do something a little different today. And it's because I swear I totally did not plan this. But we have Easter weekend next weekend. And so I think I'm going to actually read the rest of the book of Luke next week. Because we only got a couple chapters left. And we just ended up with an odd number of chapters left. So it was kind of awkward. So I figured that I would read the Passion story and the Resurrection story next week as part of our Easter reading, as well as closing out the book of Luke. So today we're going to only really read one chapter, and then we're going to kind of do the thing I've done with every other book. I kind of talk about the book and its themes as we hit the end of it, but this time we're not going to wait till we reach the end. We're going to do it now. And so that's today's plan. Today's plan, I will be reading Luke chapter 22, and then we're going to talk about the overall arching themes of the book of Luke. That is going to be our reading plan for today. I encourage you guys to follow along. I will be using the New International Version, or NIV. And I'm going to start with Luke 22. But before that, I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read today, you continue to draw us closer to you and to give us comfort and to know that we are in your hands. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so just a little preface note. Don't need to talk much about this, but basically we are moving in the final stretch of the book of Luke, which means, at the end of all the Gospels, we have the Passion story as well as the resurrection, basically the crux of Christianity in a nutshell. And so we'll be reading that today, and because before we move into it, which I will read next week, I want to talk about a lot of the overarching ideas and, of course, the evolution of religious thought that came out of the Gospels, or at the very least the Gospel of Luke, because we only read Luke. But I will make a little bit of reference to the other Gospels. But fundamentally what I want to talk about is the evolution of thought that led to the birthing of, Christianity, basically. And what led to it, what allowed, these changes to occur, and how they influence not just first century Jews, but as it grew into the worldwide religion that it is. And so that is going to be the general agenda for today. So let's just start with our short read today, because we only are going to read one chapter. This is Luke 22. Now, the festival of unleavened bread, aka the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. Now they were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Verse 7, then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." Now where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. Jesus replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you to a large room upstairs, and it will all be furnished. Make preparations there." So they left and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." Now after taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this, and divide it among you. For I say to you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to the man who betrays him." The disciples began to question amongst themselves which of them would do this. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater than the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are also those who have stood by me in trials. And I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one onto me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, and that your faith may not fail. And then you have turned back. Strengthen your brothers." But Simon replied, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." And Jesus answered him, "I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me." Then Jesus asked them, "When I sent you without purse, bag, or sandal, did you lack anything?" "Nothing," they answered. And Jesus said to them, "But now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. It is written, 'And he was numbered with the transgressors.' And I say to you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment." The disciples said, "See, Lord, here are 2 swords." "That is enough," Jesus replied. Now Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." Jesus withdrew about a stone's throw away beyond them. He knelt down and he prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. Now being in anguish, Jesus prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling on the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" Jesus asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." Now while he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" Now when Jesus' followers saw what was going on, they said, "Lord, should we strike them with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priest officers, of the temple guard and the elders who had come for him, "What am I, leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you didn't lay a hand on me. But this is your hour, when darkness reigns." Then seizing him, they led Jesus away, and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight, and she looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But Peter denied it. "Woman, I don't know what you're talking about." A little later, someone else saw him and said, "Yeah, you're also one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly, this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And Peter went outside and wept bitterly. The men who were guarding, verse 63. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they made any other insulting things to him. Now at daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." For Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you wouldn't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" And he replied, "You say that I am." In an outrage they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." And of course, Luke 22 abruptly cuts there. But I think that's enough reading for today. Chapter 22 is pretty long, but we'll get through all the components. That's the word I was thinking of. All the components. So, chapter 22 first begins with Judas's betrayal. And of course, it's one of those things that, like, it's a piece of literature everybody should just know. Should just, like, everybody should know the death of Jesus story. And so, you should also know all the different elements of that story. How did Jesus get betrayed and all that. Although the book of Luke doesn't fill in all the details, at least not in the Luke account, we do actually cover quite a bit of Judas in the beginning of the book of Acts. So we'll come back to him much later. But it is one of those things that you should just know. And so, once again, if you've read the other Gospels, they cover this in a lot more detail. So Judas betrays Jesus for a sum of silver. The exact amount is actually 30 pieces of silver. And the theological significance behind this is that 30 pieces of silver would have been the regular going price for a sacrificial lamb. And there's that whole parallel of Jesus being, the sacrificial lamb and all that. Just, all those expressions that people would know, like, if you read the story and dissect the story, you have to go through the different accounts, not just through the book of Luke alone. But if you go through the other accounts as well, it would tell you this, and that Jesus was basically purchased, if you will, with a blood price. We don't actually cover it in the book of Luke. It comes back in the book of Acts. In the beginning of the book of Acts. In the book of Matthew also covers this, where Judas feels guilty because of this blood price. And it's one of those things that the book of Luke doesn't actually cover, the parallel between Peter and Judas. And so this is where we get to the next part of the story. The next part of the story is the famous Last Supper story, where Jesus has the Passover meal with his disciples. And it's that famous, Da Vinci piece of art, the one with the Jesus and his disciples all somehow on the same side of a table. And they're all, kind of talking there amongst themselves and whatever, having a grand old time at the Last Supper. But of course, in actuality, they would not have been seated around a table. They probably would have, at least not to eat anyway, because of course, the way that the meal itself would have been done, you would have been in a circle, and circular tables were not common. Tables were generally, like, you think of, like, in movies, where it's a long ass rectangle, and you have, like, the lord of the house sits at the head of the table and everyone else is kind of on the side there. That's how tables generally were used in ancient times. Round tables was a much more newer phenomenon. Because, to be fair, it was not easy to have, to build tables in a circular fashion. Now, we possess the technology. We're smarter than that, so we know how to do it. But back then, most tables would have been the rectangle type, and Da Vinci might have tried to capture that idea. But at the same time, in a typical meal, especially among, like 13 guys, they probably would have, like, eaten the traditional way, which was everybody kind of laid down in a circle. I actually draw this up. Where's my paint? Where's my paint? Okay, give me a sec here. So the way that they would have actually have, let's zoom in, display capture. So the way they would have actually have eaten is that, okay, so let's pretend this circle is the meal. Now, the reason why, one of the things that's kind of tricky is that because this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, certain they would eat like certain things. So they would have the unleavened bread, obviously. They would have a young lamb, a year old, as prescribed in the book of Exodus. And then the people would lie around the centerpiece, and they would kind of lie around this way. And so you would reach over. I mean, you're obviously not with these tiny little arms, but you get the idea. And the people would be like kind of laid out like this around the table, and they would, well, not table, they would, well, I guess there would be a low table. And it's one of those things that, like, once again, you didn't build tables really high either, because one, you're using a lot more lumber than you need to, and tell people to suck it up and just sit on the floor. And so they would kind of be laid down around like this. And so, because they would lie around like this as well, they would also be able to face each other pretty easily. Because once again, you don't have the high chairs and stuff like that. But this was traditionally how meals were. Especially larger meals. Like when you have a large gathering of people, they would lie down around here, around the meal like this. And of course, there's another significance behind that, because it implies like intimacy and closeness if you're able to kind of lie around the table, if you will. And so the Last Supper would have been like this, and they would have either lied around it or just sat around it, like, sit on the ground. And they would eat together. And of course, this is where Jesus institutes what we call the fancy name for it is the Eucharist. Many people refer to it as communion. And basically, it's that whole, you ever watching like those church clips where they have like, they distribute a little piece of bread to everybody, usually a cracker, and then because crackers are cheap and easy to buy, and they're easy to like have a lot of. But you get a point. You get the point. It's like crackers and like a little bit of grape juice, because unless you're like hardcore, like some Catholic church will actually still use real wine, but most churches obviously don't, because the real reason is not because of alcohol content. The real reason is because that would get real expensive. And so, I mean, imagine like trying to divvy up like how many bottles of wine for like 100-person church to like take a little sip of it. It would get expensive, especially like depends on your church as well, where like some churches they do Eucharist pretty frequently. Some churches hardly ever do it. I mean, my church usually does it like once a month. So like imagine like trying to buy like bottles of wine once a month. It would not be cheap to like distribute between like 100 people. So yeah, I don't see that happening. And so typically now churches just use like a cracker and like grape juice for money saving purposes. And the idea behind that is, recognizing when Jesus left his disciples to fend for themselves, if you will, which is, kind of how the church age works. Because, of course, you read in like the book of John, Jesus is quote unquote preparing a way for us, or sorry, preparing a place for us, in the new kingdom and all that. And so, here we are on earth. Not that we have been completely alone, because of course, we're given the Holy Spirit, but Jesus basically said, all right, guys, I'm going to leave you guys on your own for a while. I mean, for over 2,000 years. I said 2 decades, 2,000 years. And so, in the meantime, we have this ritual, the Eucharist. And Eucharist is just a fancy Latin word for Thanksgiving. And of course, but the idea behind that is that we are thankful because of the new covenant. As, Jesus did say, whoops, this is the new covenant in his blood. He doesn't outright say it in the Luke version, but this is something that is a traditional Christian, ritual. And of course, if you read the book of Corinthians, Paul does mention, he says it in a much more formal way. Because of course, when Paul is reciting the Eucharist ritual, he's reciting something that has been in circulation in the Christian church for a couple of decades, at least by the time Paul wrote Corinthians. But as we read in Luke, it's kind of unclear. Luke doesn't really tell us why we don't really know why he doesn't bother to formalize it here. The ritual is just kind of like, yeah, this happened. So just a little bit of other notes talking about the Last Supper. So the Last Supper, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in the Last Supper meal. And unfortunately, the book of Luke doesn't really cover a lot of it. So, go read Matthew and John a bit for these references I'm going to mention. And of course, I will cover some of the misconceptions as well, due to like modern media and stuff like that about what goes down in the story. So of course there's the famous, like, if you ever remember I remember that whole conspiracy with, like, when people were making a big deal out of Dan Brown's the Da Vinci Code. Of course, going back to the Last Supper painting. Let's just whip it up actually. I'll show you. I should show you the painting. Just want to. Okay, there you go. This one, the famous Last Supper painting, and of course there was that. Everybody thought that, like, this person here was a woman, but this is said to be John, and John is I don't, well, it's the I guess Occam's razor would say that John was just drawn effeminately to symbolize his youth, because John is said to be the youngest of the disciples. And then there was like the in Da Vinci Code, they like moved John over to like Jesus's left side over here, and it makes it look like a woman leaning on him. But in actuality, well, okay, before I actually debunk, the reason why many people would have thought that John, would have had this like much more, do the whole leaning on the left side in like a romantic way. And of course there's all the jokes about like Jesus and the disciples being gay and everything. But in the book of John does mention that John would have been, the one closest to Jesus. And hence why in Da Vinci's painting is actually accurate that John would be on the right side of Jesus like this. Because the closest one would actually be on this side. However, since this picture is kind of ambiguous as to who is who, I guess the only thing we do know is that this guy over here is probably Peter. Because if you read in the book of John account of the Last Supper, which is a lot more detailed, Peter continuously keeps notioning to John to like ask Jesus like questions when Jesus talks about like, oh, he's about to be betrayed and everything. But the rest of the guys is kind of like, yeah, whatever, who's who. I mean, we can guess that maybe this one is Judas, because a little bit of trivia. We learned that Judas was actually the favorite, if you will. And I think there's an interesting irony in that part of this. There's an interesting irony in the story where you actually realize that Judas was the favorite. Because Judas would have sat on the other side. And in the Matthew account, as well as the John account, well, not Matthew account, sorry, in the book of John account of the Last Supper, when after Peter motions to John, ask Jesus who's the, who the betrayer is. Jesus, it's kind of one of those things where, like, when you read it, you would be like, huh? Are the disciples that stupid that they couldn't just figure out the obvious? But Jesus says, well, it is whom I'm sharing my dipping with, which would have been the person next to him sharing the dipping cup. You don't see it here. But, for those of you who know your Middle Eastern culture, and you know how those Middle Easterns, whether you're Jewish or Arab or whatever, you love your hummus. And so Jesus and Jesus and the boys would have been having hummus and whatnot with their food. And Judas would have been sharing in Jesus's like hummus cup, if you will. And it's funny that Judas was the favorite, even though he was also the betrayer. And I think there's a bit of poetic irony in that, because I think there's also this interesting parallel with how the Bible does talk about how Judas is like possessed, and he's possessed by the devil. And of course, if you read other books in the, primarily the book of Isaiah, the devil was formerly, well, we actually don't know his actual name. His title is Lucifer. Lucifer is actually a title and not a name. But basically, Lucifer was the top angel. And so, in a funny way, the betrayer in Jesus' story here it makes sense. It actually makes sense that the betrayer would actually be Jesus' favorite disciple, or at least one of the favorites, because of course, the book of John continuously paints himself to be the favorite. But the Last Supper suggests that more often than not, Judas was actually the favorite. And so, going back to the funny circular, everybody kind of huddled around the meal. If, let's say, this one was Jesus, then this one would be John, and then this one would be Judas. And then, of course, the ironic thing is that Peter would have been like over here. And of course, the reason for that is because if you read in the book of John, what happened was Peter kind of he kind of embarrassed himself earlier in the story, because Peter does that a lot. He's kind of an idiot, and he embarrasses himself. And so, because Peter embarrasses himself, he did not get the popular seats, and so he had to sit on the opposite side. And it makes sense, because when you read in the book of John account of the Last Supper, that's how Peter is like, he does like hand signals and stuff over here. And then John's like, okay, I get your hand signals. And then that's why he would lean in on Jesus and ask him various questions. And so that's the context of that. And then you have the other disciples. I actually don't have 13 guys here, but whatever. Just deal with my crappy drawing. continuing on, so one of the interesting things about the Luke account is that the Luke account actually brings up the it makes reference to the moment Peter embarrasses himself, but doesn't actually tell you what he does to embarrass himself. Because in the Luke account here in chapter 22, Jesus does have this whole discourse about what it means to be, great. The greatest is the one who serves. That rhetoric. And, every Christian throws this around quite a bit, but sometimes forgets the reference of which this, teaching comes from. And it's the one where Jesus talks about how if you want to be great, you must be a servant. You must be willing to serve. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. That famous line, which in the book of Matthew, what happened was the disciples and them all have this argument earlier in the story. In the Luke account, it's just brought up that they were talking about this. And then it leads to Jesus telling the discourse during the supper. But in the book of Matthew account, this happened earlier. And what happened was Peter and them are all talking about like who's the greatest, and Peter kind of brings up that like, well, I'm clearly the best of us because I was the one who got to witness Jesus raise a girl from the dead. I'm the one who got to witness Jesus' transfiguration on this one mountain. I was the one that did say, who Jesus was, that he was the Christ, Son of the living God. And Jesus did say, I was the one who's going to get the keys to the kingdom. And so Peter kind of gets a little arrogant about this. And, Jesus has the famous Satan get behind me thing. And because of that, Peter kind of falls out of grace for a little bit. And he's embarrassed, or he embarrasses himself by doing that. And so that comes back up a little bit where Jesus talks about what it means to be the greatest. And what it means to be great is to be a servant. And then, of course, in the book of John account, Jesus also washes his disciples' feet during this, the Last Supper. And this, of course, emphasizes the idea that if you want to be great in the kingdom, you must be a servant. And so the idea behind that is that unlike the bulk of other religions, what Jesus was trying to perpetuate of how the Christian should live is that the Christian faith isn't about acquiring greatness, but rather it's about serving people. And fundamentally, the reason for that is to show the love of God to all people, to show that God isn't about, ruling over the people like a tyrant. God isn't about just displaying his supremacy and lording over, the common folk while they suffer. That was not what Jesus intended for his followers to do, and did not intend Christianity to be treated that way. Although, unfortunately, history has shown us that, that didn't happen. But as we read through here, what Jesus is teaching his disciples, that fundamentally what he wanted was for, this new movement, which later would become Christianity, would be about serving the people. And ultimately, bring people into the kingdom of God through love. And so that's why Jesus has this whole discourse, which now we go back to Luke 22. There's this whole discourse about what does it mean to be great? You must be one who serves. And in the book of John account of the Last Supper, Jesus goes out of his way to wash his disciples' feet to show that, well, he too serves. Which, of course, would be ridiculous, like God would serve man. But I mean, what do you think he's been doing this whole ass time? So Jesus is pointing out that, like, well, God serves man. So you have no excuse now. So this brings up another paradox that makes Christianity, I know it can be a little bit off-putting, because like I know a lot of skeptics would say, well, it's too good to be true. It's too good to be true. And the paradox only makes it worse. So the paradox would be that on the one hand, God demands that, you know, we serve one another and that we're good to one another and all that. Well, what gives God the right to tell us that? Well, he himself doesn't. And, you know, I've made this analogy back when we were talking about the Sermon on the Mount, at least the Luke version of it. And I always bring this reference up because it's one reason why I love, you know, Transformers and, well, mainly Beast Wars. I was more Beast Wars than traditional Transformers. And that's because in Beast Wars, Optimus Primal, he really, as a kid, he really gave me a good impression of the meaning of leadership. Yeah, I know it's weird to say that. Like, yeah, Optimus Primal is my, you know, inspiration of what it means to be a leader. But anyway, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, so basically what happens, this is in the very first episode of Beast Wars, what happens is the Maximals, the good guys, led by Optimus Primal, are fighting the Predacons, aka the bad guys led by Megatron. And they're getting in a little skirmish. And Cheetor, one of the Maximals, Cheetor is kind of the hothead of the group, and he acts brashly and gets himself in trouble quite often because of it. Well, anyway, he gets stuck under a rock because he's an idiot. And Optimus tells Rat Trap, another Maximal, he tells him, Rat Trap, help Cheetor. And Rat Trap, he refuses. He's like, no way, I'm not going out there. Yeah, that's crazy. I'm not going out there. And Optimus is like, fine, I'll help Cheetor. So Optimus, you know, gets the rock off him, and you know, they manage to retreat to safety. While they're running away from the Predator, well, not really running away. They're having they're walking away and they're heading back to base. And Optimus chews out Rat Trap, and he goes like, "What the hell, Rat Trap? Like, I gave you you disobeyed a direct order." And then Rat Trap, you know, he tries to be a smartass about it. And he goes like, "Oh yeah, like you get to, just because you're the boss, you get to, you know, think you can just order me to do something ridiculously dangerous." And he's like, you know, why? Of course, I would disobey a direct order because that, you know, what you're asking is ridiculous. That was dangerous. Like I wouldn't. I like. It's easy for you to bark out orders. You know, you're not the one who was at risk of getting like barbecued. And then Optimus gets on his case and says, I will never give you an order that I'm not willing to do myself. And that has always stuck in my head. I've always viewed leadership that way. Good leaders will never give you an order they're not willing to do themselves. And that's kind of the litmus I use in leadership. And, you know, that's something that I've carried on to, like, not just, you know, I've carried that in ministry work. I carry that in my job now. To be a leader is like, okay, yes, a leader must bark orders, but at the same time, there's a difference between, you know, a bossy person who just tells you what to do, but then does nothing, versus a leader is someone who. The reason why a leader can be followed when they give orders is because those under their leadership know that their leader is someone who's capable of doing what they've commanded. They're not just barking orders for you to figure out, but rather a leader is simply just delegating duties to someone else because he must do something else. But he is more than capable of doing it himself, if that makes sense. So anyway, I know that's my weird leadership philosophy there, but going back to, you know, when we get to the Last Supper and Jesus talked about, you know, the meaning of greatness, and to be great you must serve. Well, what do you think the life of Jesus has been about as we've read through the book of Luke? Well, Jesus has served the people, mostly through storytelling and trying to inspire people to be better, Yeah, he obviously does the miracles and stuff too, but Jesus had spent a lot of time teaching his disciples, and that's because he wants to inspire them to greatness. And so, well, now they have to carry that out. And Jesus' life, he had been using his time with them to show that he himself serves the people. So when Jesus now, he gives the command to the disciples to serve, then the disciples should be able to, take on that role because they have seen Jesus do it. This is also another thing we need to keep in mind is that the last chapter, in chapter 21, we did have the Olivet Discourse, the Luke version of it. And if you remember from last week's stream, I did talk about how one of the things about the Olivet Discourse, and by extension the book of Revelation, I know that's a big jump there, but there are parallels between the Olivet Discourse and the entirety of Revelation. And the misconception that many people, including Christians, as a matter of fact, Christians tend to be worse at this than non-Christians, ironically enough, is that the point of the Olivet Discourse is not talking about when the end will come. Because, that's exactly what Jesus kind of calls out his disciples for asking. When his disciples ask, well, when will the end come? And Jesus tells them, well, we don't know. And we can't know. But you have a job to do, and I have called you to carry that out. That's basically what Jesus is telling them. And that's the real purpose of the Olivet Discourse. The real purpose of the Olivet Discourse, by extension of Jesus telling his disciples he has a job for them, is that he is going to comfort them. That, what I'm asking you is a tall order. But, one, Jesus has provided the example that he himself does it. And two, he won't leave, he gives us the Holy Spirit so that we won't be alone when we must do, the tall order of proclaiming the gospel and all that. We won't be alone. That is the real the purpose of the Olivet Discourse, was to give us comfort. Because, to be fair, it is not easy to want to share the gospel with people. And, it's the Christian mandate to share the gospel with people. But, we live in the 21st century now, and there's a lot of hostility toward the gospel. There's a lot of hostility toward Jesus and all that. And Jesus said, yeah, that's going to be the case. But don't be afraid. Be confident. Be bold in your faith. Yada, yada, yada. And so that is the real purpose of the Olivet Discourse. And so that comes back when Jesus talks about what does it mean to be great, to serve. And the implication of that is also, going back to the Olivet Discourse, to serve God by reaching out to people and proclaiming the kingdom of God, which is going to be a tall order. But the point that Jesus focuses on more in the Last Supper, as opposed to the Olivet Discourse, is that Jesus is reminding them that I have prepared an example for you. I have already done this. I've been living this. And so now I have called you to follow me in that way. This is where a lot of other Christians like to use that. In Christianese, we talk about discipleship and stuff like that. But basically, when they talk about discipleship and stuff like that, what they're really talking about is the idea that since Jesus had already, did all this ministry, we as his followers follow in that, and we have an obligation to do ministry. We have an obligation because Jesus has done it. And so now the reverse of, okay, Jesus won't give a command that he's not willing to do himself. Now it's to the other side of the paradox. Now we have no excuse not to do it. And so that's another thing that it can make a lot of people, especially Christians, kind of queasy about, right? Because, well, now Jesus kind of demands that we be bold about our faith and to share our faith. You can't just be okay, I'm a Christian, and then do nothing with that. You can't really be a Christian and then not be wanting to share your faith with people. Because I know, of course, like the modern PC thing to do is to, oh, your faith life, your spiritual life is all personal, and it has no place in the public sphere, which is kind of silly because, well, in a way, like your your beliefs alter your behaviors, and so if you really believe something, like for instance, like okay, if you're really a Christian, then you will adopt the Christian lifestyle and you will live that way. And so eventually, you know, people are going to notice that and they will ask. And you better give a good answer when they ask. And so, you know, that kind of thing. But, you know, when you go with the Olivet Discourse as well as the Last Supper, you know, the meaning of greatness discourse that Jesus gives, we have no excuse of like, oh, you know, be on the sidelines of the Christian life. It doesn't work. There's a actual high demand that we live the Christian life and use that to influence others. But of course, you know, the comfort is that, well, Jesus and the Holy Spirit, they will give us the power to do that. You're not on your own to do that. And that, you know, like, thank God, because, like, you know, to live the Christian life isn't easy. But the Spirit gives us the power to do it. And so, you know, there's that weird paradox, because on the one hand, you're demanded to do it, which is actually not easy, but it's expected of us to do it. And so God will give us a way to do it because he expects us to do it. And so, you know, that famous line, you know, God will give you, you know, the tools you need to do his ministry. And that's true. That is true. God will not abandon us to do it ourselves. All right, continuing on, just finish up the Last Supper thing. So basically, there's this weird part here in the book of Luke where I'm referring to like verse 30, let's say like 30, 31 to like 38. And basically there's this part where like Jesus talks about like, okay, a new time is coming. So before I told you not to carry like an extra purse or whatever, an extra walking stick or whatever. See Luke 10 and, you know, Luke 12 as well. But then here Jesus says, okay, if you have a sword, you know, carry it with you. If you don't have one, sell your cloak and carry a sword with you. And then there's a part where like, oh, we have 2 swords here, and then Jesus like, all right, that's good enough. And it's like kind of a weird thing going on here. But then of course the funny thing is that when the swords are used later, Jesus tells them like, no, you know, like this is not necessary. This is not the time yet. And so there's this interesting kind of like, what's going on here moment where Jesus instructs his disciples to be ready for battle. But at the same time, that battle has not yet come. Even when the mob comes to take Jesus, the time has not yet come. And so I always found this part kind of weird. And you know, anyone who says that they don't find it weird, question them. But basically, yeah, there's this part where Jesus talks about how there's this age of darkness coming, and you have to be ready to fight. And even use like clearly physical means, you know, carrying around a sword and whatnot. Ah. I know, I always found that funny. And then, of course, we have Jesus predicts Peter's denial of Jesus, which is also a staple part of the Easter story. I think it's just one of those things that, like, you should know the Easter story. You should know it through, and you should know it like inside and out. And so some of the elements are like, okay, Judas betrays Jesus for silver. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. You know, those are things that you should just know. even if you're not a Christian, it's just part of like you should just know the story. But anyway, that is also present in this little bit at the end of the Last Supper, because they leave this room that they were hanging out in, and they decide to go to the Mount of Olives. So one of the things too is that, like, yeah, toward the end of Jesus's life, there was a lot of, they go to the Mount of Olives pretty often. After all, in chapter 21 we were at the Mount of Olives, hence the Olivet Discourse. And now we go back to the Mount of Olives. And the explanation of this is simple, because the Mount of Olives is, well, like right there, in like next to Jerusalem. So there's no reason why if you wanted to go out to, go on a little hike, the Mount of Olives is right there. And so it works for these guys. And I guess, Jesus did like his occasional hikes. He always liked to go up mountainsides, and he was quite the outdoorsman and liked his hiking. And so they're back in the Mount of Olives. But this time is different. Jesus is not just giving them, more lectures like back in the Olivet Discourse. But here, Jesus, he just goes to pray. And this is one of those things that the Mount of Olives here, this event, shows us something that the Bible just kind of tends to like use as throwaway sentences quite a bit. Especially if you read like the book of John. It does this quite a bit. The book of Luke obviously has this from time to time. This kind of throwaway sentence of like how Jesus goes to the mountains and he prays. And as I just mentioned earlier, Jesus being the hiker that he is and enjoyed his hikes, I guess. But more often than not, the Bible just tends to like throwaway sentence. Jesus goes to the mountain, pray. Okay, yeah. And then we move on to the story, right? Of whatever he does next. But here, we actually get an insight into Jesus' prayer life, for lack of better words. Although, once again, there's obviously other context here, and that context plays out as to why Luke doesn't use this, mountain praying time, if you will, as just a throwaway sentence, but actually shows the audience what Jesus prays. And of course, it has to do with the upcoming, suffering that the Son of Man must do. And we get something very interesting here. And once again, it's a phrase that people may use. A lot of Christians know the line. But I wonder if people actually know how deep and the significance of this line is. And so the lines are, I'm just going to change this thing. Sorry, I totally forgot I left the paint on, so the screen was all bright. Anyway, the famous line is, not my will be done. Not by my will, but your will be done. As Jesus is praying about, like, the suffering that's coming. He's like, this cup may be taken from me, but not my will, but your will be done. And it really shows something about the heart of Jesus. And there's this weird dichotomy. This weird dichotomy that continuously happens within the person of Jesus. And it's one of those things that, like, once again, many a Christian will use this as like a throwaway line. But I worry sometimes that we don't hold the significance of these ideas, close enough to us. And it's this idea of the dichotomy between the God-man and the man-God in the person of Jesus Christ. And so, there are times throughout Scripture where Jesus will act like a dude. He's just like, he acts like just some guy, and but then he'll immediately flip, and then you'll see a more like godly nature come out of him. An example of this was back in, I think it was Luke, I want to say Luke 10. Let me just find the reference. Okay, in Luke 12, here's a reference of like when Jesus, he'll act like purely human, but then he'll kind of revert back to like being God, if you will. And so in Luke 12, there's a story about a guy who's like, Jesus, have my older brother split the inheritance with me. And then at first, Jesus acts very human. He goes like, well, I'm just some guy. Like, why do you bother me with this? Like, I have better things to do than to deal with you and your older brother. But then, the God side of him comes out and condemns the guy for thinking evil. So Jesus does, God stuff by reading his mind, telepathy and all that. And then he calls him out on his evil intent. Because of course, because he's God, he cannot look the other way about evil. So he has to call him out here. Even though the human side of Jesus was kind of like, well, I kind of just don't care. And, that's typical. A lot of guys feel about dealing with other people's financial problems. It's like, leave me alone. I don't care about your financial problems. And so Jesus goes back and forth between being man and being God at times. Well, we see that again here in chapter 22, where the human in Jesus is like, well, I don't want to do this. Nobody wants to be surrendered to like someone else's death sentence. Nobody wants that. So, Jesus says, well, if it can be taken from me, remove this cup, which is a very human thing for Jesus to do. He's acting more human than he's certainly acting like he's God. As a matter of fact, he's not acting like God at all there. But then Jesus immediately flips it and starts acting like God and says, well, not by my will, but your will be done. And of course, this is also, the whole like perfect obedience thing, which is the contrast between, well, men and, human beings and God, because human beings are naturally rebellious. And, that can be good sometimes because humans are meant to be explorative. So we have a natural rebellious spirit in us, if you will. But that is not God's way. And so Jesus is, his perfect obedience, even to death on a cross, shows that, well, he's being God here. Even though at the beginning of that little prayer, he starts out more human. And it's always, it's a very interesting part to observe. And, the book of Luke, the book of John has a lot of these as well, where, Jesus acts like a person, and then, or like more human, I guess I should say. He acts way more human, and then he'll turn that off to, be God. But it is interesting to see that dynamic continuously play even this late in the story. That Jesus goes back and forth between his humanity and his divinity like that. Then we get to the part where, well, basically, there's really not much else to really say about the Mount of Olives part. We just have Jesus pray, and then he gets arrested. So we have the, Judas shows up. Now, of course, if you read through the book of John account, I feel like I should have been reading the book of John then, because I have to keep referring to it if you want to understand parts of the book of Luke's story. But once again, the book of Luke kind of just glosses over these, because the safe assumption is that Luke's audience would have already known Like, I'm telling you this, like the other events that happen, because maybe you don't read the, maybe you're not a regular Bible reader. And so I have to tell you what happens. I have to give a spoiler to an over 2,000-year-old story. But the audience of the book of Luke, they would have already known. They would have known this story very, very well. And so Luke just kind of goes over like the main detail, like the main events. And that also includes when Judas shows up. Because, of course, in the book of John, Judas does leave for a while. And then he comes back to betray Jesus. And it's kind of one of those things that, like, the other disciples, you think it would be obvious, where it's like, well, where's Judas? How come we didn't wait for Judas back at the place? But whatever. So Judas shows up, and he does the famous Yoda, the watermelon meme. The Yo Judas that gay. If you guys know the old reference. Maybe I'm just being an old man here. But it's the famous, there's that one painting of Judas kissing Jesus, and there's a meme about it. I'm gonna get it. I'm gonna get the meme version because this one, the watermelon meme. Yeah, this one. I don't know if you guys know this one, this meme. Oh, what? The website doesn't give me a proper image. Can I get a proper image? The watermelon meme. This one. There you go. It's like the smelling fine, Jesus. Stop, Judas. That's gay. That moment, and so it's the part where Judas kisses Jesus, and the point of that was how it was to indicate to the officers of the temple guard. It was to indicate to them who, was to be arrested. And now, of course, you might think, well, what the heck? Why would they need an indicator? Wasn't Jesus like well known? Wouldn't people have known who he was, and let alone what he looked like? But the obvious answer is that, well, it was dark out, so it would be hard to see. And so by having Judas actually go up to him and lean in on him, then that would be enough indicator, even if you couldn't see very well in the dark. And it makes sense that it was nighttime. They had dinner earlier, so I mean, let's just say dinner was early evening. By the time they went back out after eating and spent some, who knows how long praying, in the Mount of Olives, like it's probably nighttime at this point. We also know it's nighttime because, of course, the next scene when Jesus is brought to the house of the high priest and Peter and them are warming themselves by a fire. Well, it's nighttime, so it gets chilly at night. And of course, it also gets dark. And so that's also where, like, once again, you think Peter would be super easily recognized, but people have to like peer at each other in the darkness and be like, "Hey, I think I've seen you before." And so that's probably how it actually goes down. Anyway, just to finish up the Jesus' arrest scene, I guess you could say. There's a scene where the Book of Luke version doesn't tell you, but the Book of John version mentions that it was actually Peter who had one of the swords, and he cuts off the ear of one of the official guards. And apparently that official guard was like the cousin of the high priest or something like that. I think that's his relation to him. Well, which makes sense, right? Because nepotism, was clearly, it was basically everybody did nepotism back in the day. The movement away from that is a much more recent phenomenon. where you don't just give things to family members and positions. So basically, in this case, the temple guard, and of course, you can see the problem with nepotism, because if there's corruption, well, the family would just keep it secret. They would just keep it amongst themselves and allow the corruption to fester. But anyway, basically, what actually happened in the story is that the guy who gets his ear cut off is actually like the cousin, or like some distant cousin or something. He's related to the high priest, and Peter cuts off his ear. So I mean, that's kind of a doesn't really put Christians on good terms with the Jews, and so that's the thing. But yeah, Jesus heals the guy's ear because in this story, the Luke version once again kind of just goes over it. There's not a lot of detail given, but basically what happened was Jesus tells him, no, like now is I wasn't talking about like physical violence. I wasn't talking about that. I wasn't talking about, the need to attack the royal guard when I told you to carry a sword around. That's not what I meant when I said take care of him. So basically that's basically what happened. And then once again, Peter continuously embarrasses himself, which is actually a very important thing, and we will talk about that in a little bit as I finish chapter 22. So we get to the part where Peter denies Jesus 3 times, and the story, it's one of those things you should just know about the story. And so it's one of those things that like also it is one of those things that's like weird for the Bible to point this out, and there's a reason for it. But basically, the Bible points out that Peter acts like a big, he's a big coward. I mean, a little servant girl like calls you out, and you're like, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." Oh, acting all scared because of a little girl. And Peter's like a grown-ass man, so it just looks like embarrassing for him to be freaked out by a little girl. And then, of course, other people are like, "Hey, I've seen you before. Yeah, you were with that Jesus guy." But Peter, being the coward that he is, and of course, the contrast is that earlier in the story, Peter's all like, "Oh, if everyone else betrays you, I won't. I'm going to be the one who's faithful to you to the end." And then Peter's like the one we see like chicken out. Although, even though we're so quick to make fun of Peter for being like a big chicken, where are the other disciples, right? They all ran off too, like a bunch of cowards. So, it's easy to make fun of Peter for being a big coward here. But all of the disciples were actually pretty cowardly. Which is actually very important, but once again, we'll cover that in a little bit. I just want to finish the rest of chapter 22 first. So we get to technically this is the beginning of like the execution scene, but chapter 22 cuts off abruptly, and then chapter 23 just continues this dialogue between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. And of course, Pontius Pilate, he's an interesting person because he is actually a historical person. He is actually there's records about him. He's a real person. And so once again, it's like this reference of like, okay, yeah, like as ridiculous as some of the stuff happening in the Bible is, we do know that this is like in history. And as the old saying goes, fact is crazier than fiction sometimes. And so, we have one of those factoid, moments here where we have a person who was actually around during this time period when Jesus was said to be around, a guy named Pontius Pilate. And Pilate, well, we won't talk about too much about him now. I mean, we will cover some knowledge about him because once again, next week's reading, we'll have a lot to talk about, so we might as well cover some of it now. Pilate was basically the governor of Judea because, of course, the Romans, once you conquer somebody, you don't just leave them to their own devices. So they have their own governors there, to be the authority figure, to remind the Jews, Rome is in charge. So you have a Roman governor overseeing everything. It's kind of how it is. And so Pontius Pilate was that guy for Judea. And so he would have been living in Jerusalem. And of course, he later meets the acting king, quote unquote, of the Israelites, a dude named Herod. Because, well, not the same one at the beginning of the book of Luke. That guy's been dead for years. But we are introduced to another Herod. And this guy is actually kind of important too, because Herod shows up in the book of Acts a couple of times, and he's kind of an asshole. But basically, Pilate and Herod, they know each other, and obviously they do, because Pilate's job is to make sure that, like, okay, we don't want to piss the Jews off too much, so we're gonna let them have their quote-unquote, like, king in Herod, even though technically Herod serves under the emperor, the Caesars. And so Pilate's job is to kind of just make sure that the Jews don't get pissed off because of the fact that they're under Roman rule. So we let them have some of their Jewish culture and stuff like that. But at the same time, we also enforce that, oh yeah, Rome's in charge, so you better listen, you better pay your taxes and stuff like that. So that's kind of Pilate's job. And since he's also the governor, he's got to deal with, like, political matters. And so Jesus is brought to him as such. Because, of course, what we do get more of is it here? Okay, so at the end of chapter 22, I was looking for where it was. But another reason why Pilate does get brought up is that, well, what we read at the end of chapter 22 is that Jesus' crime ends up being labeled as a political one. And it's very important that it's a political one, because, of course, in order for the Jews to have Jesus have the death sentence put upon him, they need the Roman official, okay. And so the way they were going to do that was to make a political enemy out of Jesus. And so we get to the trial that Jesus has, or basically he's just being religiously accused. An inquisition, that's a way of wording it. He's basically being, interrogated in an inquisition by Jewish authorities. And they ask him, well, who do you, are you claiming to be the Son of God? And of course, Jesus says something that is basically, like, extremely heretical and blasphemous to the Jewish leaders. But then, of course, they spin it in a way, and we'll cover this next week. They spin it in a way to make it look way more political. But basically, the thing that Jesus he's charged upon by the Jews is that he is, well, not like Jesus hasn't already been doing this, but he does it in a kind of much more blatant way. And the Pharisees also see it as kind of insulting that Jesus says it this way. And basically, when Jesus talks about how, he's the Son of Man, and he says a famous line from the book of Daniel, all the reason why, once again, I keep referring to the book of Daniel, is the part where they're like, well, are you the Messiah? And then Jesus says, well, you will see the Son of Man seated on the right hand of the mighty God. And so this is referring to the book of Daniel, where, as I've talked about back in the Christmas story, at the beginning of all this, what the book of Daniel prophesies is that there's this person called the Son of Man, and the Son of Man is a truly special person, because unlike anyone else, he is the person labeled as, like, the true God, the Son of Man. And so how this is signified in the book of Daniel is that the Son of Man appears in front of the Ancient of Days. And the Ancient of Days is the concept that every other religion has no problem with acknowledging how God would be portrayed. God would be this old wise man, kind of human but not human at the same time. Many modern interpretations of the Ancient of Days is like he's kind of like a tree person, like an Ent from Lord of the Rings. And so he's kind of like this old tree beard looking dude. And you know, that was a concept that many religions had of understanding, you know, who God is. And you know, once again, there's that whole link with like the ongoing, you know, the everlasting nature of, well, nature. And that's why, once again, the Ancient of Days is often depicted as like a tree man. And of course, you know, you think about the mythologies, it's all about trees, right? Norse mythology is Yggdrasil. The crap. What was the Greeks also have a tree, the tree with the golden apples on it. You know, you know, there's always these magic trees. And of course, once again, you know, you go back to the Garden of Eden, magic tree. It's always about magic trees. And so the Ancient of Days was described as like a magical tree man. And so, once again, the Zoroastrians, as we read in like the beginning of the book of Luke, in the Nativity story, they would have been like, oh yeah, no problem. And then, of course, the book of Matthew actually has the wise men come from the east. And they would have been the Zoroastrian astrologers. That'd be like, Ancient of Days, no problem. Magic tree man, no problem. That's how they understood to be God. But they also would have understood the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel had this revolutionary idea that we had this human-looking person show up, and the magic tree man calls the human-looking dude, he calls him God. And that would have been like, oh shit, right? Like, that would have been the most mind-blowing thing ever. So, the Ancient of Days calls the Son of Man God. And this thing that Jesus refers to is that moment where the magic tree man, the Ancient of Days, calls the Son of Man, he calls him God. And that's what Jesus is talking about when he says, well, you will see the Son of Man. How does it go here? Verse 69. Nice. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. And so that Jesus is referring to that moment in the book of Daniel. And that would have been like a big deal. The Jews would have understood exactly what Jesus was talking about in the book of Daniel. They would have known exactly what he was talking about. And because of this, Jesus is claiming that spot. And the Jewish authorities have been like, that's a big no-no. That is the pinnacle of blasphemy. And so, you know, you read like the book of Matthew version, and their outcry is like, well, what other evidence do we need? This is more than enough evidence for us to, you know, have him executed by Jewish law. But of course, you can't just, you know, they're not running under a theocracy. They're running under, you know, Roman rule. So the Jews would not have that authority to just kill Jesus right away. But that's why they're going to end up needing Pilate's help, as we will read in chapter 23. Okay, so that's all for chapter 22. I know I rambled on quite a bit there. But I want to talk about now some of the larger themes in the book of Luke as we approach the end of the story. Of course, with the Passion and, of course, the Resurrection. But let's talk about some major themes in the book of Luke. So the book of Luke, the fundamental idea behind the book of Luke was that it was a transition of an old age of religious life to a new age. There was going to be a new age. This, of course, for us as modern readers, we understand this to be what now constitutes the Christian era. The new age being the Christian era, or the age of the church, as many people like to refer to it as. And basically, Christianity was to be the catalyst of this new age. And so Christianity, well, what makes it what it is, I guess, is the question that needs to be asked. What makes Christianity, you know, the powerful force that it is? And so I know I can't. I mean, it's kind of weird to talk about like the themes of Luke now, even though we're not done reading the book of Luke. But basically, the TLDR is that Jesus had set in motion a whole bunch of things that would lead to a movement that would move away from the old ways of thinking. So this, of course, is kind of hard to explain without trying to explain the entirety of the Old Testament. But here we go. I'm going to do my best to explain the entirety of the Old Testament in like 10-15 minutes. So here we go. So if you remember back in my older reading streams, focus on like Exodus, for example. In the book of Exodus, the primary function of it was how God wanted to establish with the people, Israel, wanted to establish that they were to live a new way. They would not live in the sinful ways of humans of enslaving others and just being terrible human beings. Like, don't do that, is basically what God is saying. But human beings being human beings, and once again, you read through the book of Genesis, that you can't just tell people to not to do something, because it'll never work. And so, but that's kind of how the book of Exodus plays out. God tells us not to do something, but human beings being that we are, we're going to do it. So instead, what God wants to establish is that there would need to be a model of which they are to live, as opposed to simply just giving them laws. Because you can't just simply say, okay, human beings live like God, and then everything will be better. Well, okay, like, what does that mean to live like God? And where are the blurred lines, of what does it mean to be like God versus to try and be God? Where's the fine lines between that? And so the entirety of the Old Testament is people trying to figure that out and doing a really crappy job of doing it. And so we get to the New Testament, and the New Testament says, okay, maybe that part wasn't spelled out well enough about what does it mean to be like God. So why don't I show you what it means to be like God? Is basically God's result. Why don't I just show you what that is? And so Jesus shows up, the incarnation of God as man, so that you can see how God lives, and now you can emulate it. That is the point. But even that is not enough. That will never be enough, because there's still something within the dynamics and the relationship between men and God that will always divide us. No matter how closely you can watch God and watch how he lives and then try to copy it, you could not do it. There's still something that divides us. And fundamentally, what that is that there's this kind of inclination of fear that humans have. That's my best word for it. We have this inclination of fear. Now you go back to the Old Testament, and the joke I've played many a times at this point is this idea that Judaism, just like every other religion, were all death cults. And the reason why was because everybody gets so caught up on trying to make it to the end and just be good enough by the time you get there. And so that's how a death cult essentially functions. That's why you get caught up in like the do's and don'ts of a religion. Because the idea behind that is we live in a way of like, okay, I'm just going to do enough good deeds so that when I finally make it to the end of my life, then I will not be condemned to hell. Instead, I would be good enough and I would have worked my way to a good afterlife and just have it easy, whether it's the Elysian fields or Valhalla or nirvana or whatever. And so human beings had lived in a way that like we were so focused on like just being good enough so that death would not be too painful. That is kind of the mindset that the Jews had adopted, just like really everyone else. But if you live like that, then you miss out on what it means to be like God. And of course, this is where, when we talked about earlier in the book of Luke, in Luke chapter 20, I think it is, or 21, we talked about last week, the part where how is God described? How does Moses describe God? Well, he's God of the living. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the God of the living. Well, what the hell does that mean, to be God of the living? Because it's easy to be gods of the dead. That's an easy concept. Everybody can be a god of death pretty easily. But what does it mean to be God of the living? And so this is where Christianity, the evolution of religious thought that Christianity brought about was this idea that we don't just settle for becoming gods of death ourselves, but rather we can be brought to life by the God of the living. So, how does that happen? Well, the TLDR of it is that basically when Jesus rises from the dead later on, which we will read next week, he's basically saying that like death isn't the end, because that's something that humans would have been accustomed to. Why every other religion is basically a death cult idea. But in Jesus rising from the dead and being alive, well, then you don't have to be stuck in, focusing on death. This revolutionized how Jewish believers viewed their spiritual lives. And the Christians in the first century really made a point that they were going to live a new way. So, from an historical example, would be how the Christians moved the day of worship. And there's a couple reasons for this. So, traditionally, the primary day of worship would be the Saturday. The Sabbath falls on a Saturday. Saturday is traditionally the end of the week, it's the seventh day. And of course, you go back to the creation story, and on the seventh day, God rested. And so the idea behind that is that everything exists to come to that end. But in the Christian worldview, they changed that, and they moved the day of worship to Sunday. And so the mindset didn't it went from the old way of thinking of, well, we just live our life. You ever heard that old Solomon Grundy poem? Solomon Grundy, born on a Monday, christened on Tuesday, married on Wednesday, became sick on Thursday. I can't remember. No, sorry. He became sick on Thursday. No, I don't remember. I'll look it up, actually. But basically, the idea was that okay, so I have it in front of me now. So basically, the old death cult idea was that, you just come into this world, you live for a while, and then you die. And then, everything you accomplished was meaningless. This is where, like, the book of Ecclesiastes kind of plays on this idea. And a mega hot take I have is that, like, the book of Ecclesiastes is actually wrong, which is ironic. Which I know some people get defensive about it, but it's in the Bible. So it can't be wrong. The word of God is inerrant, which is not what that means. But basically, the book of Ecclesiastes talks about like the pointlessness of it. And so, oh, he became worse on Friday. Okay, so okay, I'll read the poem, but I'll read it in full properly. But I'll just get to my point first. That with a lot of no amount of God telling you what is good and what is not good would change, the conditions that people were stuck with. That we're here on this earth for a while and then we die, and then that's it. And so, this is where the Solomon Grundy poem comes in. Solomon Grundy, born on a Monday, christened on Tuesday, married on Wednesday, took ill on Thursday, grew worse on Friday, died on Saturday, buried on Sunday. And that was the end of Solomon Grundy. And so the Sabbath was, treated as like the day you die. And then, the next week begins, you're buried on the next, Solomon Grundy's buried at the beginning of the next week, and it's just kind of like, yeah, whatever, right? Does it even matter? But when the Christians moved the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday, Sunday being the first day of the week, it was a declaration on Christians saying that, like, no, we live. We live because Jesus lives. And so because Jesus lives, we are empowered to move on. And so our day of worship has the beginning of the week we worship so that it can inspire us to move forward. And of course, to do the things that Jesus had called, his disciples to do, love God, love people, serve others, yada, yada, yada. And so now we are empowered to do that. And that is, at least in theory, why, Christian organizations go out of their way to do what they do. That's why you have a lot of these like Christian outreach programs that help the poor or help refugee groups or whatever. And so it's one of those things that, like, I know this is make a hot take, but I used to always like try and be a smart ass to people when they're like, trying to say that, like, oh, make themselves look great or whatever. And it's like, well, it's not about you being great. And, when people kind of talk down about like how bad Christianity is, it's like, yeah, we've obviously had our flaws, but at the same time, even despite those flaws, Christians still operate in a helping other people mindset. And yeah, it's so easy to be cynical about like, well, Christians do it with their own purpose of making other people Christians. It's like, well, think about like how LGBT community, they want to convert people to their mindset. But here's the thing I always try to, here's the thing, I'm a bit of smart ass. But like, okay, where's like my LGBT organization that outreaches to help people? Where's the LGBT, outreach program that helps homelessness in your city? None exists in Vancouver. None do. Most of those organizations, the bulk of them are Christian organizations. And then, of course, other religious groups, you know, uh, co-opt it, but that's fine. But you have to acknowledge that it is Christian organizations that do it, because, of course, it is at the core of Christian ideas that we serve other people and then we help them, because that is what Jesus called his followers to do. And so by extension, that is what Christians are supposed to be doing. But, mega hot take, black BML, right? Or BLM, sorry, BML. BLM, or Black Lives Matters, they don't have that same inclination. There's a huge organization that's supposed to be helping black communities. But then, of course, you realize that most of them are a bunch of con artists. So there's that. And they're way more blatant about it than, say, your average Christian outreach organization. There is no Black Lives Matter founded housing group in Vancouver. You don't have that. Of course, what we do now have is a competition between government groups, or why people want big government, because they say, well, why don't we just have the government do it? But then the problem with the government's system of saying, like, creating an outreach program, say, for indigenous people, not that I'm against helping people in, a particular ethnic group, but the problem of having the government do it is that the government's method is to, all right, let's increase everyone's taxes, which, once again, why would you want government to do it if their way of doing it is to increase taxes when everybody hates taxes? That part's already baffling. But anyway, they would have to increase taxes, and then the way the government does it is that it's indiscriminate, so everybody has to help. Now, on paper, that sounds like a good idea, but it diminishes something about the human character. And you think of, like, maybe this is me being old-fashioned, but, like, if I wanted to be believed to be a good person, I want people to believe I'm a good person because I choose to be a good person, not because someone else just says I'm a good person. I'm a good person because I choose to be one. And so if we have, like, forced, like, okay, having big government, and then everybody has a good person, but then, Syndro from The Incredibles would be correct in saying that, well, nobody's special. If everybody's special, nobody's special. And so, as much as people have the good intention of, like, okay, we should just have, government handout and then make everybody contribute to it. It's like, well, it doesn't make you a good person, because you're not being a good person because you choose to be one. You're helping people because someone told you to do it and someone forced you to do it. And even then, that's a little iffy, because, of course, you think of things like government handout. Is it really doing good? And so, but that's besides the point. But you're not a good person because you yourself are good. But in one of the things that Christianity tried to push was that it 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 made it about how you acted. And so it first uses Jesus as the model. So Jesus is like, okay, I will do this for you. Going back to the Optimus Primal thing, the good leader thing. So I'm going to give you an order, but I'm going to live out that order first. So Jesus does that. And then now he says, all right, now you must be good because I've done it for you. I have served you, so you must serve others. And so the Christian is called then to emulate Jesus out of who they are. And so, but at the same time, you have no excuse as to be like, oh, well, I don't want to do it. You can't be a Christian and say, I don't want to serve. Because Jesus says, well, the example of being a Christian that I've given is that, well, I have served, so you must also serve. And so the book of Luke was moving to this idea that, like, okay, we as the people must be good to each other, because that is what God always demanded from us. Even though in the book of Exodus, that wasn't conveyed very well, because even though that is the main commandment, love God and then, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself, that wasn't conveyed very well in the Old Testament. People got too caught up in the do's and don'ts and to worry about being good enough to not get, the hellfire. But by the time we get to Jesus here, the focus was not meant to think about would you be good enough in death, because death should be the least thing you think about. And how do you bring that mindset to people? And that's where Jesus brings in the resurrection. The resurrection would completely change that mindset. You're not thinking about, am I good enough to when I die? But rather, since Jesus has given us life and life forever, then you can focus on how to live well, how to continuously live well, how to be serving others in life, how to be a blessing in your life, how to be life-giving. That is what we are meant to be doing. And that is the fundamental crux of Christianity and its message. That Jesus has given us a way now to have real life. And the famous John 10:10 passage is that Jesus has come to give life and life to the fullest. And so what does that mean? How do we then go about that to have life to the fullest? And there's a lot of nuances in that, but the fact of the matter is that now there is a new way of living. And that was something that the evolution from Judaism to Christianity was supposed to bring that anyone can have, not just anyone can have life, but that any and everyone could participate in a new life that would not be diminished as time passes. Of course, I understand there's a lot of skepticism behind that, because of course that does sound too good to be true at times. How can the stuff we do in this life ultimately play out and pan out in the eternal? But I think the way the Christian goes about it is that, well, you are already part of that experience now. Even, this world is a rough place and we're still stuck with sin in this life and all that, but through the forgiveness of Jesus and the new life that he gives, you live in a state of that you only have to move toward the new life. That is how we are supposed to be living. And so that is fundamentally what the book of Luke is about. Of course, how that plays out, you don't really see as much of that until the book of Acts. The book of Acts' purpose is that as Jesus has given us that new life, well, what do we do? What's next? And how do we go forward? And of course, we'll have many a talk about that, because the book of Acts is so rich in how they tackle that question. And of course, the book of Acts is kind of like the pretext you need to understand, well, basically anything else that Paul writes, because he writes a lot. So if you want to understand basically any of it, you need to have a good working understanding of the book of Acts, which, thankfully you can get that here with yours truly as we delve into the book of Acts in a couple of weeks. Of course, I might take a short break after I finish the book of Luke next week. My idea is to actually start Acts almost in May, because we could just start on the 29th, which is close enough. I think we'll start on the 29th. I could wait till the 6th of April. I think that might be too long a break. But I feel like 1 week isn't enough either, so it's kind of weird. We'll see exactly how we go about it. But what I will tell you is that the 22nd for sure, which is 2 Fridays from now, we will not do a reading stream on the 22nd. So with that said, I do want to start the book of Acts pretty soon, because it's so weird to think we're already going to May. And so we'll be, as May approaches, we'll do the book of Acts. And the book of Acts, I think, is probably one of the best books in the Bible in my mind. That's just my opinion, I guess. But I've always liked the book of Acts, because I think what makes it so great is it really tackles that challenge of the Christian life. What does it mean to move forward? What does it mean to have this new life in Jesus? And so I hope you guys will, look forward to that. And that will be in a few weeks, because next week we'll finish the book of Luke, and I'll kind of just go through the resurrection story and spew out the regular, Easter kind of sermon style messages when we talk about like the death and resurrection of Jesus. But the book of Acts, which will come out a few weeks after that, will delve into, well, what does that mean for you and me? Because of course that is the fundamental question of the importance of a religion. And that's another thing that, was part of the evolution of religious thought, if you will, that Christianity presented, was that it did bring new questions of what does it mean to be a believer? What does it mean, to move forward from your religious convictions of accepting Jesus, his death and his resurrection, and the forgiveness of sins in that? Well, what the hell does that mean for you moving forward? And so the book of Acts, I think, is really great to really have us wrestle that question, not just within what the Christians did in the first century, but also for you and me as we move forward in life. Anyway, that's it for themes on the book of Luke. We'll finish off Luke next week. So that will be Friday the 15th, which is, yes, Good Friday. I swear I did not plan this. I did not plan to have reading the last part of the book of Luke fall on Resurrection Weekend. I swear I didn't plan it. But that's how we're going to do it. So that would be next week, April 15th at 3 o'clock Pacific time. We'll finish the book of Luke. As far as next week's streams are concerned, we're going to just have 3 streams, business as usual. So we'll have Triangle Strategy on Monday and Wednesday, each of them at 2 o'clock Pacific time. And then next Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time, we will finish the book of Luke. And then starting the 29th, probably the 29th, I don't think I want to take too long a break. Probably on the 29th of April, we will begin the book of Acts. And then, yeah, that's the foreseeable future. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. My throat is dying now. And I'm tired. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed reading through the book of Luke with me. I know we only did 1 chapter today, but there was a lot of things to talk about as we wrapped up the book of Luke. So, with that said, this is going to be the end. Hope you guys enjoyed the book of Luke with me. I will see you guys next Friday for the rest of the book of Luke. But of course, definitely come out for Monday and Wednesday's Triangle Strategy, because, dude, man, I'm at the end game at that point, and it's pretty sick. So you guys should definitely come hang out with me as I finish the game. But yeah, that's going to be it. I hope you guys have a great Friday night. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And I'll see you guys Monday at 2 o'clock for Triangle Strategy. Have a great night, and God bless you.